All right, I'm really looking forward to this next panel. I'm really and excited about the representation that we have here up on this panel today, this morning here as well. Thank you all very much for being here. This particular panel, the committee, the Summit Committee, we had conversations about this. And of course, our foundation is in the journalism area, and we work with a number of press-related organizations out there nationally as well. And I had an opportunity to attend the Night Media Learning Seminar, and there was a breakout session that brought a number of the ethnic minority news organizations together to talk about what they were doing in their particular communities. And then the idea about how some of the, we're dealing with these freedom of information and open government challenges out there on a broad basis, but there are some journalism groups out there that have some unique challenges based on their organizations and based on their audiences out there. There's a number of socio-economic challenges that are going on out there in communities that some others aren't affected by, certainly in the areas of criminal justice, national issues like immigration and that don't touch a lot of us out here, but touch a lot of people in this country as well. So we thought we'd have a panel where we could bring together the 4 major ethnic minority news organizations and bring together and just literally have a conversation and talk a little bit about it. And, these are groups that NFOIC wants to work with on a national basis, and certainly each of these organizations have state chapters as well, and it's important that the state coalitions also develop those. And I know that some of you all already have some people on the board of directors from some of the organizations that are represented here as well. We've got another good local moderator that's going to join and run this panel discussion this morning with Ayan Mittra from the Texas Tribune, an editor there, and his bio is here, but everyone is familiar with the Texas Tribune and the national impact they've had and their business model. And Ayan, we really appreciate you being here this morning as well. And let's turn this over, and we'll look forward to it. Thank you all very much.
Let's see, here we go. All right, thanks everyone. Thrilled to be here, and thank you to Dan for organizing this panel. My name is Ayan Mittra. I'm the editor of the Texas Tribune and a board member at the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. Thrilled to be here with these distinguished panelists. I'm going to do my best to talk as little as possible and let the experts talk. But I first want to just kind of give a brief introductions for everyone. First, seated immediately to my right is Kevin Kemper. He's a private practice attorney where he focuses upon the needs of indigenous peoples. He also handles freedom of information and First Amendment cases, and he also helped start a legal hotline for the Native American Journalists Association. He's a former journalist and journalism professor and licensed in Oklahoma and tribal courts in Oklahoma and Montana. To my far right is Cheryl Smith. She's the publisher of iMessenger Group, which includes Texas Metro News, the Garland Journal, and iMessenger. She also hosts a talk show on radio, Cheryl's World, on Blog Talk Radio. She has over 30 years in the industry and serves as a secretary for the National Association of Black Journalists. To my immediate left, joining us straight from College Station, where he covered the spring football game yesterday. Thanks for being here, Ben. Ben Baby is a staff writer at the Dallas Morning News. He has covered college sports there since 2016. He's also worked at the San Antonio Express News and the Denton Record Chronicle. He's a native of Grapevine and a graduate of the University of North Texas. And to my far left, also from the Dallas Morning News, James Barragan. He's a state government reporter based in Austin, covers immigration, border security, and voting rights issues. He's covered the legislature's approval of the Sanctuary Cities ban and is following its effect on communities around the state. He also covers the straining Texas-Mexico relationship. Not only is this just a great panel just for their experience, but also for the organizations that they represent. And I'm hoping to just start off by asking each person to talk a little bit about the organizations that they represent, the different journalism associations. Maybe Kevin, we can start with you.
Halito, Chimachokma, that's hello, are you good in Choctaw? I've been a member of the Native American Journalists Association for a long time. Lost track how many years. We're an organization that partners together not only with people who cover Native Americans for mainstream media, but particularly tribal media. A lot of tribal radio stations, newspapers, newsletters, websites, and whatnot out there. And we're seeing a growing representation of people using social media to report on issues in any country. I also want to add that I'm a board member of FOI Oklahoma, and we have a pretty good representation over there. So.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a secretary of NABJ, and I bring you greetings from our national president, Sarah Glover, who wanted to be here, but we have a lot of programming going on. And I just thank you for including us and also for this discussion, because it's very critical, especially when you look at the assaults that are going on in the media. And I'm not going to sit up here and be a conspiracy theorist, but you are in Dallas, Texas, and the conspiracies run rampant. And in fact, in November every year, they have theorists come from around the world who talk about what happened in the 1960s in Dallas. I'll just leave it at that. But we really have some discussions we need to have, because people are finding skillful ways to try to keep information from us, and we have to unify. We have to come together and fight back.
So, as Cheryl said, we do have some conspiracies here in Dallas. One of them made that the Cowboys win the Super Bowl every year. And for the last 23 years, it's been debunked, so we'll see if that goes for another year. I represent the Asian American Journal Association. I think we have a chapter here in Texas, and it's a really neat group. You know, I think it's still fairly young, and you know, there's really not a whole lot of us, I would say, in the business. Usually, my parents think I'm going to med school, going into my law degree, so they're like, all right, when are you going to be done with journals and stuff? So there's a lot of other people who can relate to kind of being an Asian American in the business, which is always neat. I think we've got the record of most Asian Americans in an SEC press box is 3. So we're hoping to get 4, and every time we do it, we'll take a picture, we'll document it, so we'll be there. But we're really excited to be here. You know, I think it's important for the AAJA to have representation on this panel. We're definitely honored to be here, and we're looking forward to it. It's going to be a blast.
Let me just use this one.
There you go, yeah.
Does this one work? Okay. My name is James Barragan. I am a state government reporter with the Dallas Morning News, and I'm also a member of the NAHJ, National Association of Hispanic Journalists. I am the immediate past president of the NAHJ chapter in Austin, where I work, covering the state government here in Texas. And thanks to Dan Beverly for having us. My executive editor, Alberto Mendoza, asked me to be here to represent our organization, which has 2,500 members nationwide. We've got chapters in a lot of the major cities, all the major cities in Texas. We got Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio. I think we got one in El Paso that's fledgling a little bit. I don't think we have one in Houston, so if anybody's from Houston wants to start a chapter out there, please talk to me. Anyway, one of the big things that I think we're trying to push with NHJ is partnerships with other journalism organizations. We are very invested in diversity and diversifying every part of journalism. And as you all can probably see here, there needs to be more Black and brown journalists in these conversations. I'm going to talk specifically about immigration and some of the issues that we have around that. You guys are going to have to forgive me. I'm a little bit out of practice because I've got the state legislature going on, but I've got a couple of years of experience under it, and I emailed my buddy Patrick Michaels at the Center for Investigative Reporting, who you should follow if you're into immigration news because he's amazing, and he sent me some tips that I'm eager to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So, you know, this panel was meant to set up to talk about just, you know, how specifically issues of press freedom and open government challenges affecting organizations and, you know, primarily centered around people of color. So we're going to go right into it, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just talk about the trends and challenges they've seen individually and with the organizations that they represent. So, Kevin, I'm just going to start with you if you want to just dive into it.
All right, so quick trivia question. How many federally recognized tribes are in Texas? How many of you know? Nope. Almost. 3. You have the Tiwa Pueblo in El Paso, you have the Alabama Cachada, and you have the Kickapoo down on the border. Now, quick trivia question, and this table cannot answer. How many federally recognized tribes are there in Oklahoma? 38. So the score is Oklahoma 38, Texas 3. All right. Oh, you know, and I'm going to tell a personal story. My sister will get mad at me, and I know this is on video. My sister's brother-in-law is Attorney General Ken Paxton. And he came with the Texas Rangers when my sister married her husband, and we're at the little country church in Oklahoma, and he said, well, I've never met an Indian law attorney before. I don't know Indian law. I wish I could have had that on video or audio, given some of the cases that are coming out of Texas that are against tribes. But the bottom line, let me ask you, how many of you have ever done a story on or about a reservation or a tribe? Handful of you. Where's the guy from Maine? Did you know that there's a Supreme Court case in Maine that tribes are under your Open Records Act? Yes, and it's a rarity. There are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There are numerous other state recognized and non-recognized tribes. The way I want to present this to you is that NFOIC has 50 constituent states, right? Well, what about recruiting 573 chapters for FOI in Indian country? Yeah. You know, it's the difficult. I want to talk a little bit about some cases that involve myself and involve the legal hotline that a lot of people don't know about. I'm going to start out with some of the smaller ones. You know, like I was licensed in the Osage Nation Tribal Court. We successfully represented a woman who was going to be jailed for up to a year. Tribal courts can prosecute misdemeanors. She was charged with a felony basically for inciting riot because of some comments on Facebook. And we managed to get that dismissed out of court, and we're grateful for that victory. We have, you know, right now, I'm not going to say which state, but we're contacted by a NAJA member recently who's fighting because she's doing journalism for a journalism school project, and an intertribal council is pressuring her not to publish it. So we have lots of instances of censorship. Now, I'm just curious, how many of you in here within the United States have ever done anything journalism related where a rocket launcher and snipers were aimed at you? I have. It was called Standing Rock. And we were there, I remember negotiating with the state police for North Dakota while there were armed National Guard troops, and trying to get, there was this bus where they were broadcasting, the protesters, the water protectors were broadcasting a radio show in a bus, but it was muddy. I remember that day, it was snowy, there was smoke from explosions. The troops were lined up to just come through and take over the main camp. And so if you're doing media law, journalism or whatnot, and you're in the United States and they have a rocket launcher, now they said they used it for the communication abilities that it had. I think it was the closest thing they had to like the cannon that Custer must have had. Okay, so these are the kinds of things we deal with in Indian country. Just this last year, and actually I'm a substitute for Sterling Hosper, who had been in charge of Muskogee media for the Muskogee Creek Nation, but you might have followed the story where the Muskogee Creek Council voted to do away with their Free Press Act. They were the third in the nation to pass one and the first to revoke it. Now, we got involved behind the scenes, and it was, you know, basically, if you don't reverse this, we're going to sue your butt. I don't know how much that factored in the decision. They voted to reinstate it, but it was a weakened version. A lot of people have the false idea that in Indian country we don't have freedom of the press. I did some research from, I got a batch of tribal constitutions from the Department of Interior. Matter of fact, there's a lawsuit I'll mention real quickly. I had to sue the Department of Interior. Now get this. To get a copy of the tribal constitutions and articles of incorporations they had on file. And in the settlement where they paid my attorney's fees, in the settlement they admitted that they didn't have the constitutions and articles of incorporation of certain tribes. But we did find, and presented at SBJ New Orleans a couple years ago, I think it was over 70% of tribal constitutions either have direct or indirect protections of free press. There is the Federal Indian Civil Rights Act, but the section where free press is mentioned, the Supreme Court has interpreted doesn't it can't be enforced by the feds. And so I want to explain to you really briefly that actually speaking here representing NAJA, speaking here because I represent tribal people. I don't typically represent tribal governments, okay? I represent tribal people. We need your help. And it's not only the constituent members of NAJA, but it's the tribal people themselves. We had a place at Standing Rock called Facebook Hill where you could barely, we believe that there was evidence that the government and whatnot were choking off the cellular power to us, the cellular reception. But people would try and upload videos onto Facebook. And so it was a reporting hub. And a lot of tribal people want there to be transparency in government, but we have to deal with issues like tribal people are suspicious of those who are not tribal because they wonder what you're trying to take away from them. And that's really touchy given how tribal peoples have survived the genocide that was perpetrated against our people for hundreds of years. So when journalists show up, they're not going to immediately trust you. And I want to ask you real quick, anybody here old enough would admit you did journalism before FOIA was passed, and was it 66? Anybody here, you did? So how did you get records? Has anybody wondered that? Before you could make a FOIA request, how did you get records? I'll tell you, we do it every day in Indian country. How would you get records?
You go to the nearest courthouse or nearest, and you dig it out, or you start talking to people.
Exactly, and the way I wanted to frame it is you built relationships. You were people's friend. You became their friends, and you would cultivate that relationship. In Indian country, it's the same thing. Where's the closest? And I'm going to pick on them a little bit. My family has land in Chickasaw Nation, and then being Choctaw. So if you go up 75, you'll get to the Choctaw Nation, and there's a huge casino. If you go up I-35, you'll come to Thackerville, right across the Red River. There's a huge casino. And journalists often wonder, why. I've been told by my sources that Chickasaw Nation sovereign wealth is about $2 billion. Okay, they have the largest casino in the world. So, people ask tough questions, but neither one of those tribes have FOI acts. Neither one of those tribes have FOI provisions. I did do a study in one of my Master's of Law theses. The majority of tribes in Oklahoma have FOI provisions in their constitutions, but the FOI right belongs to the members. That's one reason why NAJA encourages tribal people to do tribal journalism when possible, because you have better access. But even, and I tell you two quick anecdotes for when I was in Arizona, the kind of things we deal with. One, I sent a records request on a research project to the feds, the state of Arizona, and the White Mountain Apache. I'll name the tribes. And I got results from the feds and from the state, but not from the tribe. And I met that attorney several months later. And he said, you know what was funny about your request, Kevin? He said, you acted as if you had a right to those records. Well, I'm not a member of the White Mountain Apache. They're a sovereign nation. Do I have a right? Under international law, yes. If I got the records through making a mere request to the feds or the state, yes. But, that's just kind of dicey. And then my favorite story, I know Dave's heard this a million times from me. When I was in Arizona, I called the Tohono tribe, and I was looking for an open records statute. I said, do you have an open records law? And I'm quoting this after all these years, word for word, when I spoke with the chief secretary. Well, she said, we have an open records law, but it's secret. And I need to get permission for you to see this secret open records law. And I tell that not so that, you laugh. I don't want you to laugh at tribal people. I want you to understand the kind of challenges that we have when we want true, honest, accurate information. I will tell you something, because I represent these kinds of folks all over the country, either up in Montana or in Oklahoma. I get phone calls from all over the country. The people, the traditional people, the elders, believe in FOI. They believe in transparency. They want to hold their tribal governments accountable. And therefore, we don't have a lot of easy answers. We have lots of fights, and we don't have lots of ammunition, and we sure don't have a lot of money. But if we could partner with organizations like what's surrounding me here, with NFOIC, if you can understand better what we deal with, like I said, y'all worried about 50 jurisdictions, I'm worried about 573. And we have a huge task ahead of us, but I'm really grateful to be here to talk about these issues. Thank you.
The theme is going to be that, unfortunately, we have all been under attack at one time or another, and we're getting it more and more frequently. But when you look at black people in America, and now we're hearing black nationalists, extremists, we're hearing all of these buzzwords used for African Americans in America. But if you go back decades, you may have called it the Black Power movement. But whatever was going on, we were under assault by one of the most formidable opponents you could have, and that was the FBI. And we've all been under attack at one point or another. I'm going to tell you some interesting things about those challenges that we deal with as we deal with black identity extremism, as it's referred to. But I want to talk about, just yesterday I was at a press conference for our Dallas County District Attorney, and he talked about how he was having a hard time getting information from our police department. And so they are going to take steps to make sure that they're not going into trial and then the police department says, oh, here's some information. You know, I talked with one of our members who actually worked for a district attorney in another state, and she talked about all the ways that they creatively held back information. Redacted information, how it took longer to get it. And we talk about unifying and coming together because, yes, they responded quicker to the larger organizations, but what about John Q. Public coming and asking for information? What about our smaller organizations? And that's why it's important for us to see a fight and get in on the good fight, the right fight, instead of standing by. We've had a number of presidents. It's nothing new, and some of us were here last century, so we know that there were other presidents that tried to keep information from us. In fact, it was a period of like maybe 12 years that it was really hard to get information. So now when we ask for things and information and it takes longer, we can blame it on the administration, and we can look at what the culture looks like, that folks feel that they have a right to hold back information. And this, what we've seen in our communities are that those holding back of information has led to people being wrongfully incarcerated. And so we have people who are vigilantly, like yourselves, that are just on it and saying, okay, we have to join together, we have to make those requests, we have to demand, and there are certain things, you know, because some people have to pay for their requests. Now, we have younger groups, you know, and they say millennials. Are there any millennials in here? Oh, look at you. Oh, really? Yeah, we are so blessed because they know everything, don't they? Millennials know everything. But anyway, as we look at things, one thing I've seen, like from some of these young groups, they're doing, like you said, ma'am, they're getting the information. They're going out talking to people and doing that journalism that seems to be missing. And so you have groups like we have the Next Generation Action Network here in Dallas, and they were, you may have heard a few years ago, they had a rally, and during that rally, 5 police officers were killed. And they asked for information, they gathered the information, and they asked the hard questions, but you know, they always worry, and a lot of our groups worry about being attacked. If you start going after the government, does the government start coming back after you? And a reporter came up to me a few weeks ago because we've had a lot of scandals in Dallas recently. And we've had elected officials. In fact, if you've been around last week, someone was sentenced. The week before that, someone was sentenced. And it's just, so I was at the courthouse, and so I was talking to some of the special investigators and everything, and they were saying, we're going after the folks who bribe, and we're going after those who accepted bribes. I said, oh, you're gonna try to get it right now. And so a reporter came later and she said, Cheryl, you cannot say things like that to the government because they're gonna come after you next. And I said, well, what did I say? And she said, well, you were just challenging them, saying that they haven't been getting it right in prosecuting folks. And I said, well, was it not true? And she said, yes, but you can't come after them. So there's a fear. How many of you are afraid of the government? Good. Good. Well, and that's why we need to be working together, because fear and faith can't exist in the same place. And we need to go out there and we need to get the information that we need to get, because historically we have seen that it's harder for us when you're doing it by yourself. And folks need to get in on the good fights and speak up. And when we see something wrong, you know, they were talking about there was a murder of a rapper in California, and the attorney from the O.J. Simpson trial is representing the alleged shooter. And so folks are upset at him for representing, but you have to think about those who, what if attorneys just said, okay, I'm not going to represent you? What happens to you when you're wrongfully or rightfully, you know, charged? Do you do it because it's the right thing to do, or you do it because of it's popular? And we have a lot of issues that are not popular. We have the black press. We feel like the black press is not respected. And we, you know, and we've gone through, our industry has morphed. That you can't say, oh, I'm print, I'm broadcast, you know, I'm digital. It's all lumped together. You have to get with the times. So that's really important that we understand that. So getting with the times and knowing that we're going across mass platforms, we have to realize that we have to go across these organizations. We can have our separate organizations, and NABJ has over 4,000 members, and we have 5 regions and chapters, you know, all across the country, and we do a lot of stuff internationally also. But if we only focus on our issues, then you know, what happens when there's no one there to help us with ours? We're not going to do it. We have to do it together, because we're not going to be able to make an impact alone. And so, you know, I listened to the district attorney talking about how he was having issues. I talked to another elected official where there was some kind of ruckus going on with the governmental agency, and he's saying, I'm going to give them 1 more week to get that information to me. And, you know, you have limitations, and then sometimes folks have to take it to the streets. We weren't having rockets launched at us, but we had dogs and all kind of other things going on. There were bombings, and we're dealing with, you know, immigration. And the thing about it, the immigration is not just an issue about Mexico. And when we focus on just one issue, then ultimately we all suffer, because there are so many issues that are interrelated. And that is, you know, that is why it's important for us to communicate more, to share, to find out what is going on. You know, I loved Unity Journalists of Color, because we got together and we discussed the issues. And since I attended sessions with them, and there may be some people here from Washington, D.C., but I never say your football team's name, because guess what? My brothers and sisters of the nation said it's offensive to them. And I think we need to find out what is, instead of telling us what should offend us and what shouldn't offend us, we should ask and find out what is offensive, and then realize that at some point in time, there are going to be things that offend us. I came to Texas, I'm from New Jersey. These white men calling me gal just didn't resonate. You know, and I remember, and some of you who are old enough remember the Dallas Times Herald, and we were sitting down there, and he kept saying gal. And I was like, we don't do that, but they do. But, you know, understanding, it's having a conversation. But back to the point, as we look at the dissemination, how we're seeking and trying to get information, we have to do our jobs. The Freedom of Information Act that has had its challenges, and we got some really good rulings in terms under the Obama administration. There was a little help there on some of the areas, but then we're finding ourselves still in an assault. And like I heard from the bureaucrats, basically they just say, okay, we're gonna get to it, and then, but we're on deadlines. We're trying to get information out. Some things are so important. So what do? We need to be able to get up and get on a phone, call Ben, call Dan. Let's all get together and come out and let them know that you cannot hold back information. You cannot treat us the way you're treating us, because it's essentially continuing to happen. And with NABJ, as we look at our members and we say, okay, we're looking at the disparity. You know, the New York Times doesn't have an issue like, you know, maybe the Tyler Times. They don't have the same issue, but New York Times needs to speak out about what's going on, because it's overall what's the greater good. And that's what I'm hoping it will come from us getting together, spending time together, talking about what our issues are, because guess what, they're the same. They're one and the same. We all are dealing with trying to do a good job, trying to represent our communities and leave an impact that is worth talking about for those who come after us.
It's going to be y'all have made some excellent points. And first off, I just want to say it warms my heart to see so many people here talking about open records and freedom of information. You know, I was joking with Dan Ayan. I said y'all must have been scrounging at the bottom of the barrel if y'all got a sports guy coming up here talking about open records. But you know, and it's fun. You know, it's one of the things I love to do. I cover college sports, and so I think the A&M people know me on a first name basis by now because I submit so many, and A&M likes to withhold their information as tightly as possible. So it's always fun submitting open records and doing that. You know, from the AJA's perspective and kind of from my perspective, you know, it's fascinating. You know, we're talking about this and getting ready for this panel. You know, I was thinking about how much that the idea that you can really challenge authority, you know, it's literally a foreign concept. I think when you look at a lot of our communities, and you know, for starters, you know, we talk about, you know, the Asian Americans as a whole. I mean, you're talking about a whole lot of different cultures and a lot of different people. You know, even in India, and I'm Indian, you can, you know, there are so many subsets of different cultures and so many different languages spoken that it's really hard to get everybody, you know, on the same, you know, everyone's gonna have so many different experiences, and that's within their own country. Then you go out and you look at all of Southeast Asia, and then you go look at Asia as a whole. You know, it's hard to account for a lot of different things, and so, you know, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush because I only know what I know. You know, but in going through this and in the research for this, you know, I think that there is a sense that, you know, over there, you know, like especially in India, you don't really challenge authority. It's not something that you necessarily do. You know, I know, like, you know, especially in school is a perfect example. You know, when we talk about whatever the teacher says, that goes. There's no challenge anything. If your child comes home and the child says, oh, you know, the teacher is, you know, saying this, that, and the other, the parent's going to go, well, the teacher's right. If you're challenging them, the teacher, by all means, is going to be whooping you in school, and the parents are perfectly fine with that. You know, and that they said, you know, this is the way you do it. This is the way, you know, we've been brought up, and you just have this respect for authority and power. And the Open Records Act really is kind of an affront to that, because it gives us, you know, just citizens the ability to go out and challenge, you know, the people in power and people in position. You know, it's something that you really don't see. Like, you know, going to India, I'm going to go challenge, you know, the police department. I'm going to go challenge my elected officials. I mean, that's just it's something you don't really see all that often. And so, you know, when you come here, when you immigrate, and I think this goes for a lot of immigrants, I think figuring out open records is it's not high on the priority list. It's all right, how am I going to survive in this country? I've got X amount of dollars, I've got X amount of resources. I'm just trying to stick around and make sure that my next generation's set. And so I think there's a general lack of knowledge about the fact that open records exists, and that you have this great tool. And and I think that could be argued for not just immigrants and just certain subsets of cultures, but people as a whole. I think a lot of people don't realize that you can go get information. It doesn't just have to be journalists. I think we do it because it's part of our profession, and it's something that we've been trained to do. But I think the whole point of the act is everybody can go out and go out and if there's something they want to know, by all means they should be able to go submit an open records request and get that information. And I've got a unique perspective coming from sports because a lot of people don't think that sports writers submit open records and whatnot. And since I deal with education and deal with a lot of public institutions, sometimes that's the only way to get information. I mean, A&M generally does not release contracts. I've got to go out and get contracts. I've got to go out and get emails when people don't want to talk. I've got athletic directors across the state who don't want to talk. So that's fine. Let's get your phone records. Let's get your text messages. We'll get you talking one way or another. And that's the beauty of the law is that and it's funny, when I first started out, like I was just so intimidated, like the whole act in general. And I don't know if it's because of the way I was brought up, or just being in sports and whatnot, or just the background coming up through the newsroom. But I was just so intimidated in submitting open records, even like getting contracts, and just knowing, okay, what can I get, what can I not get? And over time, a lot of it is trial and error. I remember the first time I submitted I worked for a small paper in Denton, which is about 45 minutes north of here. And I requested a contract, and looking back, I realized that they took the salary information out of the contract. And I was like, oh yeah, that's great. Sure, it's not in there. Now I'm just like, they probably ended up fleeced. I got fleeced on that one. And over time, you know what you're supposed to look for, and you get better at it. And one of the things that I am, if there's something I don't know, I think as journalists, you go out and you find people who know what they're talking about, know what they're doing. So for me, luckily I work at a really strong paper that's got a great investigative team, and so I'm always down there picking their brains and say, okay, I've got this is getting kicked to the AG, how do I write letters in this, how do I find case information that will back up my argument, and do a lot of these things. And so it's just being knowledgeable about the act and like reading it and reading, case exemptions. And, every time that, me and, it's funny, I'm on really good terms with A&M's general counsel, more so than probably I am with people in the athletic department, which is pretty interesting. I wrote them an email thanking them during Sunshine Week. I said, even though we don't see eye to eye, I appreciate the fact that we can have a conversation, and we are going to be at different odds. I mean, you're a lawyer protecting your organization and your administration, and I'm going out and trying to get those records from you. So kind of it's fun. I kind of treat it like a game sometimes. Okay, all right, who's going to end up winning here? You you claim this, I'm going to go claim that, and we'll go to court and we'll see who wins. And I think that's kind of I take a lot of fun in that. I'm a pretty competitive person, and so I said, I was talking the other day. I said, hopefully we'll get the records you're trying to keep from us. And we'll go from there. But then, no, it's not personal. It's what, we each have jobs to do. In terms of Asian Americans and how it affects us, I think a lot of it is basically the biggest thing is making sure that journalists are covering those communities that may not have a voice. I think that goes for all of us up here. I think that's really the biggest thing, because it's up to, newspapers and media organizations generally aren't going to get charged for their records requests. I mean, if you do, you can kind of barter down. We know the tricks. Okay, you want to charge us X amount of dollars. Well, we think we're being overcharged here. Why don't we go inspect it in the office? That way you don't have to reproduce. We can find the labor hours. We go, okay, we're very well versed in this. However, people in certain communities aren't going to necessarily know how to go about this. So if they're getting charged a lot of money, they're going to think that's going to be the only way to go about it. I remember when I was coming up, I was like, oh, I guess I'm supposed to be charged this much. I didn't know that you can complain to the Attorney General and say, hey, we're being overcharged. You can have a conversation, with open records coordinators and go, okay, I think this is we're not looking for this, we're looking for that. You can kind of have a conversation and a dialogue, and at the end of the day, get what you're looking for. And I think the biggest thing when I was thinking about how we go about, how does open records, specifically impact Asian Americans, I think really on a broader scale, it's not just Asian Americans, just communities in general where maybe your newsrooms may not be covering it. And I think that's the biggest thing, is making sure that you have diverse voices in a newsroom to have an ear for what other people are going through that you may not be aware of. Kind of what Cheryl was talking about, what one group will deem offensive may not be offensive to somebody else. But the only reason Cheryl knows that is because of her experiences, and everybody here, like the name for the Washington NFL team, I won't say it either because I know it's offensive. And a lot of people in sports, they just go, okay, we're going to say it because that's a team name. Well, I go, no, if people are offended by it, then then it shouldn't be said. That should be changed. I mean, that goes for the University of Mississippi. I won't, they generally go by Ole Miss, and I'm like, I just don't go by Ole Miss. And I think, there's a lot of, Confederate idea, symbolism there with, their nickname being the Rebels, and they played Dixie just not too long ago. And I go, there's a lot of people offended by this, and some people will point out that you don't say Ole Miss in your copy. I do say the University of Mississippi or Mississippi University, and it's just having an ear for that and just making sure that you have a diverse background. And I think that's really the biggest thing. And if there's one thing I want to point home is that we need to make sure that we have an ear to different parts of our cities and different parts of the people we cover. And you need to be serving a large base of your readership if you're doing this thing right. And that's the best way to know, okay, what are these things, what are these communities going through, what are the issues that they're facing, so then we can go out as journalists and go get the records that we need to tell their stories. Because at the end of the day, if we're not telling their stories, who is? So I think that burden falls on us to go out and do that. But it's a thing that not just affects Asian Americans as a subset, but as a whole, especially in the time that we're in now, and people are kind of restricting open records and wanting to peel back because generally if you're in power, why wouldn't you? If people are picking at you, I mean, I deal with college coaches all the time. They go, why do we got to deal with media all the time? We should stop giving them media access. I mean, I don't want to deal with this. I'm making millions and hundreds of millions of dollars a year, over the course of a salary, why do I need to be needled about what I'm doing with my quarterback or what we're doing with this or what we're doing with Title IX? If you're in power, you generally don't want people trying to take power away. I mean, I get that. That's a very understandable thing if you're in power. But thankfully, one of the things that makes this country so great is that we have, statutes and laws that let us go, criticize the people in power and go after people in power. And I think that's something that we need to realize and just basically just educate those around us. And, one of my favorite phrases that we put in stories is according to open records requests. And I love that phrase because it lets the readers know that we're going about this and we're using open records. Because if they don't know, they're not going to care whenever we're getting declined and whenever the AG is not ruling in our favor and there's certain things going against us. I think one thing that the readers need to know is that a lot of the information they're getting is from open records. So whenever, why are they going to care about Boeing versus Paxton? Why are they going to care about certain loopholes that are keeping information if it's their information that's being restricted? If the readers don't care, ultimately it doesn't matter. It's our job to make the readers care and to know why it's important. And so I think that falls on us, and I think I've rambled a good amount, and generally that's what I do. But, I think that's, there's a lot of things that we're all talking about here. I think it falls across a lot of different parallels. And, no matter what background we come from, especially as all minorities, we all know that there's certain things that afflict us that may not afflict the majority as a whole. So I think that's just something to be cognizant of, as we go about our reporting. And I think the more you're in tune to it, the more it'll ingratiate your reporting and the way you go about your work on a daily basis. So.
Okay, so just a couple of quick things. One is that I moved to Austin 5 years ago, and I'd never had allergies, and somebody told me, wait a couple of years, and sure enough, here I am, first time I'm suffering allergies. So I just want to reassure the panel that I'm not sick, it's just allergies, and apologize to the people on the recording who are hearing me cough. Another quick thing on what Ben said about, records and having to pay for them and, being able to barter down. You can't always barter down. I mean, those records, sometimes we still got to pay for them, and they don't pay for themselves. So I think to one of the questions in the previous panel about operating costs and stuff like that, if there's a fund somewhere where we can go apply for a chunk of money to pay for our open records, I'd love to hear about it. And more power to this table right here. I'm right there with you guys. A lot of traditional legacy media, I think, gets left out of the conversation because we're chasing shiny new things, and we're the ones out there doing it. And we've been doing it at the Morning News, we've been doing it for more than 100 years. And we're the paper of record here, and And I think people are chasing a lot of shiny new things, and it'd be nice to have some operational help for the folks who've been doing it for a long time. Every panelist here has talked about sort of the mistrust that there is within communities of color towards journalism. And I try to refrain from being the angry brown man as much as possible, but I think we got to understand that there is a reason why communities of colors do not trust journalists. And that's because they don't have journalists that look like them. They don't have journalists that understand what issues they're going through. And in reality, the way that the federal government, that local governments have oppressed people, Black, brown, Native Americans, is very real, and it is very true. So we've got to understand that, and we've got to have a conversation about what we're doing to change that image. And I think the theme of what I want to talk about here is really being able to speak the language, right? And being able to speak the language in many different ways. So we talked about a little bit about just the lack of literacy that there is around media literacy and freedom of information. So the average person doesn't know that you can go and request these records, right? The average person doesn't know that you can just go and literally just go up to your city hall and say, how much does my mayor get paid? How much does my city council member get paid? They don't know that. They just have this idea that wow, they're getting paid some money, I'm sure it's more than what they ought to be getting paid. But they don't know that they can actually go ask that and actually receive that. And that should be a free records request because that should be open, right? So I think there's got to be a conversation about just that very, very basic fact, right? That people deserve the right to know. And I'm actually on the Freedom Forum Institute's Journalism Advisory Board for media literacy. And we're having a conversation about what can we do to better, to improve the public's understanding of media and what we do. So I think that's the first part of you got to be able to speak the language, and the average person should be able to speak the language of just being able to know. And luckily in Texas, really, I think in Texas, although the Attorney General might have some other ideas, in Texas, if a document exists, then it belongs to the public unless the government has a good reason why it shouldn't belong to the public. That's the way our Open Government Act works. So that's the first thing. The second thing about being able to speak the language is that, to Ben's point, I think there's got to be more representation. And this is not a knock at all, but I think it's just something that we've got to be aware of. But I think if you look at the room here, I think there's more Black and brown people up here than there are over there. And that's not a knock, and I'm thankful to Dan for inviting everybody, but I think that's something we got to be aware of, If we're going to have a conversation about how open government and freedom of information works, then, Black and brown people got to be in that conversation. And so we're thankful for having this space, but I think we all got to be conscious about how do we bring Black and brown leaders into the conversations to be in leadership positions, right? It's like that New Yorker cartoon. You guys ever seen it? Where it's the boss and says, "Secretary, bring me someone that reminds me of a young me." And we've got to get out of that way of thinking. We've got to go look for new young people. I always push whenever I see a young Black or brown journalist, a young woman journalist. I always say, hey, especially in the Capitol, as Ayan knows, it's a tricky place to work, and there's so many procedural things, and it's very much like freedom of information, where there's a lot of procedural things that you got to do over and over again before you get the hang of it, and there's little tricks and things that you can. So whenever I see a young person of color or a woman of color who's I know is new in the Capitol, I always say, hey, if you're tripped up on something, come by and ask me, because I can help you, and we're all in the same boat, and we're all rowing in the same direction, and we're all as confused. Someone's been as confused as you've been before, so come and help me. So now getting to the actual part of the freedom of information part, I want to give a big shout out to the Center for Investigative Reporting, and they're most famous right now for their Reveal radio podcast, which some of you might enjoy. The thing that I appreciate them the most for, and am forever grateful to them for is the Reveal Fellowship, which is a fellowship that helps identify young, diverse journalists who want to go into investigative reporting, and funds them for a whole year for $10,000 worth of records requests, of payment, of mentorship and help, and they help you develop a project. You come with a pitch, but they help you develop a project, and then they walk you through how an investigation works, and they walk you through all the Freedom of Information Acts that you got to file, and you get to work with their legal counsel, and so it's amazing. And so that's one of the things that maybe I think folks should look at. So anyway, last year I did this program, and I was looking into, we had Hurricane Harvey in 2017 here in Texas, and I was looking into how workers who rebuilt the state after Hurricane Harvey were not paid. So their wages were stolen. They promised them, hey, you're gonna get paid X amount, and then the contractors left them and didn't pay them, right? And as you can imagine, here in Texas, where we have, I think, the second largest undocumented immigrant population, a lot of those workers were undocumented workers who didn't speak English, don't know their rights, are afraid of going to report wage theft to the authorities. And so we had to file a lot of records requests for that. And so just a couple of tips, and again, thankful to Patrick Michaels of the Center for Investigative Reporting for some of these tips. When you're dealing with immigration, the first thing you gotta know is that we all know if you're filing a FOIA, they gotta get back to you on whether or not they're gonna fulfill your request, or more than likely, why they're not gonna fulfill your request, or why they're not gonna fulfill it in 20 days. The federal government will get back to you, or the agency will get back to you and say, here's why we're not responding to your request, right? When you file a records request with ICE, it's not unusual for you to be waiting for months or even a year to get your records back. And so, you want that information now. A lot of you guys are editors, you want that information yesterday. And so for a reporter to say, damn, a year, months, that's tough. So a couple of tips that Patrick gave me while I was working at CIR, and then just in a reminder email that we had. One is look at the FOIA library that the agency has. ICE keeps a FOIA library, a repository of all the records that have already been filed, and a lot of them. Sometimes the information that you want is already there. So you want to know maybe how many arrests there were or whatever. Sometimes the information is already there, so go check that out first. Secondly is that and this works mostly if the undocumented person that you're working with is a Mexican national, because the Mexican consular network is so super strong, especially here in the United States. It's a super strong network. And so if there's like a couple of weeks ago, we had an ICE raid in Allen at a technology company where they arrested a ton of undocumented people, right? And so the Mexican consulate actually has this understanding with ICE that if their folks get arrested in an immigration raid, or in any arrest really, if there's an immigration arrest or a detention, the Mexican government, if the person arrested, say if the immigrant detained, they have to be offered, let me say that again. The person who is detained, the immigrant who's detained, will be offered legal aid from the Mexican consul if they want it, right? Sometimes they don't want it because they are not trusting of government for various reasons. But a lot of them say, wow, someone wants to come talk to me and represent me and get me out of this mess? Sure, let's talk about it. And so if they accept the help that is offered, then the consulate has to go and talk to them. And what does the consulate do? They find out why that person was arrested, how old they are, their name, right? So you don't have access to ICE records right away, right? But you can go to the consulate and say, hey, I heard there was an arrest, or I heard there was a raid last week. You guys know anything about that? Did you guys go help them out at all? Do you guys have names? Do you guys have reasons for the arrest? Do you know if these people have criminal histories? That's one way to get around it, right? And another way to get around it, obviously, I think some people have talked about it, is in a lot of detentions, or if a lot of these companies sometimes are bad actors who employ, purposefully employ undocumented immigrants because they know that they are afraid to exercise their rights or don't know that they have rights. So another one of the fellows in the Reveal program last year had something about a jail suicide in an ICE detention center, and there was a lawsuit, right? So if you can find a lawsuit, then a lot of the documents about the workings of, in that specific case, how that ICE detention center works are in those lawsuits, right? So we talk about the problems with FOIA, and we talk about how long it takes agencies to request it. Oh, another one is, so if ICE, for example, doesn't want to give you the records, go to DHS, go to the HHSC, go to different agencies that potentially have those records, right? You don't have to go through ICE, and ICE is gonna be like, oh, well, we have a plethora of records to get through before we get to yours, right? But perhaps, you know, there's a shorter wait list for HHS, or perhaps there's a shorter wait list for DHS. So that's another way to go get around it. So back to the point I was making, we have all these complaints about FOIA, right? And in my case, we have complaints about the watering down of the state Open Government Act. And to Ben's point, people in power are not going to give up their power easily. We got a couple of really good actors at the state capitol who are pushing for changes to our state government act, Open Government Act, but generally people in power are not going to give up that power, right? So we can sort of complain amongst ourselves, and I'm sure there's a lot of really good lawyers here that are fighting for that change, and more power to you. But for reporters, I mean, we just gotta pony up and like go and actually do what people did before FOIA, and like go get sourced up, man. Go get sourced up. Go get the documents another way. And I'll give you another example of this. You know, when I was working on that story about the workers who were not paid, and that's just flat out wrong, right? Like these people rebuilt the state after the most devastating storm that the state has seen in a very, very long time. And these people rebuilt the state, and then you don't pay them the meager wages that you promised them. That is just wrong in every which way. And so I was talking to one of the guys who had filed a complaint against one of these employers. And he says, yeah, I filed a complaint like last week. And so I went to the Texas Workforce Commission and I said, hey, I heard there's another complaint filed against this company. Can you send me that, please? And of course, they took their 10 days, because that's how it works in Texas, is 10 days. And they said, we don't have those records. We don't have those records. There's no complaint against them. And I got back with this guy and I said, excuse me. I got back with the worker and I said, hey, they said that they don't have a complaint. And he said, no, I filed that like 2 weeks ago. And he told me like, I filed it like I'm just gonna make up a date, March 24th against XNO company. And I said, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, I'm sure, I filed it. Like I filled out a paper and I filed it. And so I was like, okay, to Patrick's point about sort of, I haven't made this point, I just made it in my head, I'm sorry. But he said, okay, I filed it, just making up a date, March 24th against James Barragan company, right? And I went back to the Texas Workforce Commission and I said, hey, I think y'all need to check your records again, because I know for a fact that there has been a complaint filed on March 24th against James Barragan company. So please go back and check your records, right? And they went back, and the next day, I got the complaint. So that is another piece of advice that Patrick and I were emailing about. Because we know that the wait list for these records are so long, be as specific as possible when you're filing your records request. I think everybody knows that, right? But like, it happened on this date. It happened at this location. 53 people were involved. There was a blue dog. You know, because you wanna be as specific as possible. Because the other thing that they'll do also is they'll take your request and they will send it to you in a package like this big, and you got to go looking for the needle in the haystack, right? So be as specific as possible. And then one final thing about speaking the language, right? So a lot of these workers were undocumented immigrants. Some of them were Cuban immigrants who, if anybody's familiar with immigration law, they're in a little bit different situation with the wet foot, dry foot policy. And so they were a lot more outspoken, right? And so there was a lot of them who had filed complaints about having their wages stolen, but then there was a bunch of them who hadn't. So if you've got one person who this has happened to, and I was in a good situation because I speak Spanish, and so I was able to have a good rapport with them. And we even talked about like how we speak differently and we speak funny. Like to me, their Cuban Spanish is funny, and to them, my Mexican Spanish is funny. But anyway, I said, so are there more people who this happened? Or I think they were saying like, oh yeah, it was our group, and we were like protesting, we wanted our wages. And I said, wait, there's a group? And he's like, oh yeah, like 5 of us filed complaints, but there's like 12 of us who didn't file anything. And so we found much more people who were affected by this. And so just to speaking the language again, like if you speak the language, you have a better rapport with them. And then if it's happened to one person, you can bet your bottom dollar it's happened to a bunch of other people. So ask them about, hey, you know other people who this has happened to, can you put me in touch with them?
So I've got to say, this has been the easiest moderating gig that I've ever had in my life, and I'm grateful to the panelists. We are short on time, and I know, Cheryl, thank you for being here. I know you have another commitment you need to get to. I think we will, I'd like to just, for the record, I did have other questions, but I think it's probably better to go straight into audience Q&A. We have a few minutes, I think, before we have to break. If there are any audience questions, just please raise your hand. I think we have a mic going around.
Just a quick question. I know that your associations have annual conferences, and I'm wondering the level. Do you do sessions on public records laws regularly, and how would you rate the level of understanding of some of your members on how to get information from the government? Because I know when I've done things, and when someone learns how the laws work, it's very empowering, as all of you have sort of mentioned. But I wonder how much of that kind of training your associations offer.
I think it's low. To be honest with you. Again, a plug for Albert, our executive director, who has really put an emphasis on partnering with other media organizations. I think at last year's conference, which I did not attend, but I know that we were trying to, or we partnered with IRE to try to get some more literacy around these issues. But to be honest with you, I think it's low. I think it's very, very low. And so, again, thankful for you guys for having us here. We really need your guys' help to be able to educate our members, because obviously these are important issues. There's 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country, and some people say that's a low number. But it's important, and it's low. And I for one would like to see a lot more emphasis on FOIA and on open government at our conferences or in our regional meetups.
I'd like to add to that. Actually, with the Native American Journalists Association, we're flip of that. It wouldn't be NAJA without a session with all of us complaining about free press problems. And so we constantly have these issues. I will give a shout out to Brian Pollard, who used to be editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, who's now working full-time with NAJA. There was the launch of something called the Red Press Initiative, and they're in the process of surveying our members about what kind of hands-on problems that we're encountering. And so maybe, I know that we were talking earlier, there used to be a group called Unity where the different organizations, I don't want to get into that about why we don't have unity, but I do want to say that we can practice unity by maybe collaborating more about these kind of resources, because we do that.
And NABJ, in fact, last week I was in Birmingham, and we partnered with IRE also, And you're seeing a trend in journalism because, I can remember when last century when I said I wanted to be a journalist, and my parents, once I started doing talk radio, they thought I was supposed to be making Oprah money, and but so they had not a clear understanding of journalism. But I talked to more and more students across the country, and they're not wanting to be the investigative journalists that we wanted to be when we got in the business. A lot of them want to be entertainment. And so we're working on trying to get more of them interested in doing those stories and doing the reports that we want to see done. And I have to tell you that you talk about us educating journalists. It would be nice if we had forums in our community so that they could understand, because people are not trusting of the government, and they're actually afraid, so they feel unempowered. And once you start mobilizing, whether it's Muslims, immigrants, if you become a group, you can expect to hear the jokes when folks are on the phone saying, well, my phone may go out because they're listening to me. There is such suspicion when it comes to the government. And so we talk about diversity. For me, I have always said, and NABJ stresses, we need to see the people there, but we also need to see a diversity of mindset. It shouldn't be if I am in a group that I'm the only one can speak out about something that's wrong. Everyone should be able to see and discern what is right and wrong and share that. But we're working on it and trying to get people to say, when someone says they want to be an investigative reporter, our eyes light up. We're like, wow, it's like it's Christmas or something you're seeing. And because a lot of people, I want to be an anchor. I want to be an entertainment reporter. I want to do, those type of shows. And so we're struggling to get more people in those seats in journalism schools.
All right, any other questions?
Hey y'all, thank you so much for the work that you do over here. So I want to ask two questions if I could, and I know we're running short on time, but the first one is, James, I'd be particularly interested in your perspective on whether you think things are getting better for journalists of color, particularly in mainstream newsrooms like the one that you're in. And then secondly, maybe one of you can address what you think white journalists should be doing to work better on the issues that you all are addressing now.
Putting me on the spot. It's a difficult question. Because for myself, things are good. I'm 20 years old, and I'm a state government reporter at the Dallas Morning News. Pretty sweet gig. 20 years ago, people worked their whole careers to get to where I am right now. So it's a little bit difficult. So on a personal level, it's great. But I see other young journalists coming straight out of college who, and the problem is they're like super bright kids coming out of college. And then, and personally for me too, I'll tell you, I was at the LA Times. My first job was at the LA Times. I was a MetPro fellow, and it's one of these minority training programs. And the LA Times has had a big resurgence in the last couple of years. And they're doing great work, and they're doing very reflective of Los Angeles, a very, very diverse coverage. But when I was there, the program was in title, it was a diversity training program, but in practice, it was sink or swim. And if you were, again, to the point of speaking the language, if you, and I hate to put this just on the Times, but in a lot of newsrooms, right, including my own right now, I think, we hire a lot of young journalists coming out of Yale, coming out of UNC, coming out of Harvard. Not a knock against any of those schools, great schools obviously, but it's a lot about the pedigree and the title, and what comes with that is that you speak the language of people in power, and you know how to schmooze. As you all know, journalism is kind of it is a lot about networking. It is a lot about networking. And for folks like me and maybe like Ben and maybe like the other folks up here, we don't necessarily know how to schmooze and how to network that way. We don't speak that language. So it's very difficult for me. And I think that was one of my big problems at the LA Times. I've learned since how to do that. Obviously, I'm here. Thank you, Dan. And I ran the chapter for NHJ in Austin. But I think there's to journalism's credit, I think there is a bigger emphasis on getting more diversity into newsrooms. I know Ayan's newsroom really tries to focus on that and is always on the lookout. But I think one thing we gotta think about, and this happens in my newsroom a lot, we get a lot of really talented and super diverse. Your intern class looks great and is super diverse, right? And of course, those kids are happy to be there. They're at the Dallas Morning News, they're at the Texas Tribune, they're at the LA Times, they're at the New York Times. It's easy to have a diverse class when you're at the internship level, right? It gets less easy as you go up the ladder. And that is because there's not equal pay for people of color. There's not equal mentorship programs for people of color. So when there's issues getting editors, people in my positions who are State House reporters, political reporters, and when there's trouble getting those people or candidates of color for those positions, those are the reasons. And that's why, again, I'm super thankful to the Center for Investigative Reporting, that Reveal Fellowship. Man, it's made me a hell of a reporter in the last 2 years just because of that program. We need more programs like that, and we need people to put their money where their mouth is, to not just say, here's a diversity training program, but to actually put the dollars. They paid me $10,000 throughout the year, flew me out to Berkeley several times, maybe 3 times, for week-long trainings with them. And they paid for all my FOIA requests. They let me talk to their general counsel. She guided me through how to write a FOIA letter. Those are the things we need. We can't just say, yeah, we'll have, black or brown girl, we'll have you, you can be our intern. We gotta put our money where our mouth is. So it's getting better in the sense that people are focused and are paying more attention to diversity. I think it's still about the same in terms of helping those people actually prosper and have careers, especially as newsroom budgets shrink.
There are so many who would say that the numbers aren't better, and if you were in Dallas 25 years ago, they were actually protesting in the streets about the numbers, and you go and you look at the news organizations now, and guess what? It's either the same or worse. You have newspapers across this country who won't even turn in their reports and give their numbers because they're so dismal. And so when we talk about what can we do, well, we have to work together, and we have to understand, instead of, someone may criticize and say, well, why do you have a National Association of Black Journalists? Or why do you have this? Because clearly our issues were not being addressed. And so it's about working together and having those tough conversations, because lots of times when we're talking about, when folks want to say race, is it race or racism? Is it lack of knowledge, or we're just not communicating with one another? The numbers look dismal, and you say, how do we make them better? How do we bring along people with us? And some of my best mentees over the years have been of different groups. I applauded a young man at University of North Texas, young white man who drove 60 miles every day to come and work in my newsroom. And I'm a small Negro newspaper. But he knew what I brought to the table. He felt that he could learn from me, and he came there every day and actually walked away winning awards. And if I had had the resources, guess what? I would have hired him. And it sounds like a joke because I had a white male from North Texas, I had a Latina from Texas Tech, and an African American. So I was like, I'm getting ready to tell a joke, a black female from Texas Tech. And, oddly enough, the first one I would have hired would have been the white male because of what he did, what he produced. He went out into the communities. You have to learn these communities wherever you are. And sad to say, sometimes the people of color don't like going into their own communities. They aren't, everyone who is Latino, they do not speak Spanish, whatever if they're Puerto Rican, Cuban, or what, a lot of them have come and they shy away from it. But it's important for us to be the journalists that we say that we want to be, and that means you go out and you find out, you put your feet to the pavement and get to know communities and know issues, because there are some people, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, there's someone who said, well, they shouldn't be here working anyway, about those who did not get paid. That's how people, or how we have become so insensitive when it's someone else's plight. The jail in Fort Worth, 100-degree weather in Texas, and they had no air conditioning. And there were people calling in on the radio and saying, well, you commit a crime, you just deal with it. And you know, that's not the way we should be living.
Yeah, not to steal Kevin's thunder, I feel that he's going to make a great point, but just to piggyback off of Cheryl, I'm a kid, you know, I'm a kid from the hood in Los Angeles County. You know, I grew up in neighborhoods that were primarily Latino, but there was a lot of black folks, there was a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia, and there were a lot of poor white kids. So I'm a product of, you know, LBJ's Great Society. I participated in Upward Bound programs. I took Pell Grants, and I took a lot of the FAFSA to get through college. And one thing that I think is missed, to your question over there in the back, I think one thing that is missed is that it's not just about racial diversity, it's also about socio-economic diversity. So when I sort of rail against looking for the pedigree of a Harvard or a Yale, it's not because, you know, obviously those are great institutions, but if you really want to get at the problems of like these underrepresented communities, you got to get people who speak the language, who are from there. One of my best friends at the LA Times, Kate Mather, who now left the Times and is going to law school in Berkeley, but she's from Kansas, and she said, we always used to complain about the same thing, and she said, we're the same, you know, you're from the hood, I'm from the trailer park, we're the same, and we're all the same. The socioeconomic perspective is we all have the same experience, and you can have, I think to maybe Cheryl's point a little bit, you can have black folks, you can have Latinos, you can have Asian Americans, you can have Native Americans who are from a higher socioeconomic strata, and they don't necessarily reflect the same perspective that I have. They reflect the perspective that is seen in Harvard, is seen in Yale, is seen at Duke, and that's another part of the issue.
Well, and maybe what I would like to add to that might be a good way to close. I know we have a time issue, but to the question about what can white journalists do, you know, I can say in Choctaw, Chatasia hoke micha shilaki micha naholo, which means I'm Choctaw and I'm Cherokee. Naholo has kind of a sarcastic meaning these days. It used to mean the sacred ones, and it's what the tribal people, the Choctaws, called white people, who were supposed to bring us this book that's supposed to tell us how to love one another. But instead, they showed up and raped our women, stole our land, killed our children. Okay, put my ancestors on the Trail of Tears. And so, yeah, right, you're Naholo, you're sacred, you're something special. And so I want to give you a voice that might come surprising from somebody's Choctaw blue eyes, okay? For all my life, I was a journalist. I got a PhD in journalism from Missouri. I believe in journalism. I believe in what you do. But if you're going to show up to Indian country and you're going to, oh, those cute little Indian babies, they look so poor. And have that kind of attitude, like you're going to tell us how we need to live. Or you're going to show up and it's like, well, you know, hey, you're going to have powwow. That makes for great photos. Like if you're going to have that attitude, my advice to you, and I'm speaking for myself, not Nadia, for this, go home, stay away, leave us alone. Because I made a commitment, when I was in Missouri, there's a Walter Williams creed. We're supposed to serve the public as journalists. And I made a decision, I decided to go tribal ways instead of other ways later in life, just because of just things that I went through. But I'm here to tell you that tribal journalists do journalism because we're passionately defending our people. And if you want to get to know us, be human, and I think there's something good though that the Lakota say, and I'll probably not pronounce it correctly, but it's Mitakuyasan, which means we're all related. Okay? We're human beings. Just be a human being. Don't be a jerk. Just get along, just make friends with us, work with us. You do that, you treat us like we're human beings, those of us who come from different backgrounds and whatnot, we can do some awesome things together that bless everybody. But like I said, if you're just wanting to show up to Indian country, I speak for Indian, if you show up for Indian country and you have designs that will end up hurting our people, I'm not your friend, I'm your enemy. Okay, because we're going to protect our people. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you understand that I'm trying to come from it from a good heart. So, Matakuyasin.
All right, well, you know, we asked four of the major journalism associations, the Ethnic Minority Journalism, if they could recommend some representatives from their organization, and I think they sent us a stellar panel here, not only to represent their organizations, but represent journalism and journalists out there. So I really appreciate you all. Cheryl, Kevin, Ayan, thank you for moderating, and Ben and James as well. I just want to mention to you all before, Ben is kind of our prodigal child. Ben was on our panel before we went to print, and he had a commitment that took him off, and this weather, how this weather giveth and taketh away, it gave it back. Ben here a couple days ago, he said, hey, I'm not conflict, can I still be on the panel? So we thank you for being with us and joining us today. So thank you all very much.